we'll get started here in just a second. All right, if you're just coming in from the waiting room, go ahead and make sure you're muted, or I'll have to go back and mute you. Thanks for joining us this morning for our State Master Gardener webinar series. This topic is going to be managing diseases in brassica crops, and this is the first webinar of the year, so we're going to kick off on our state focus theme, which, Grace, do you want to talk a little bit about what the state focus theme for the year is going to be?
Sure. So our state focus theme for 2025 is going to be home food production. We'll have some resources coming out from the State Extension Master Gardener Office, hopefully later this week. We've had a wonderful collaborative planning effort with volunteers and coordinators across the Commonwealth. We're just trying to get all of those resources that we came up with compiled into an easy to use format. But I'm excited to start with a continuing education webinar that should help us do a little bit better in working with the Brassica family in our home gardens. It's one that I have problems with, so I'm hoping that this helps the rest of us throughout the state as well.
Perfect. So we're super excited this morning to welcome Marian Grskovich and Emma Nieland, who are both master's students in plant pathology, and I'm going to turn it over to them to introduce themselves in just a second. Just a reminder, if you could save your questions until the end, you could put them in the chat and just leave them there and they will be addressed at the end, or if you want to wait and unmute yourself at the end to ask your question, that is also fine. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us this morning. And we will see you back here on February 18th at 2 p.m. for turfgrass disease management, which is also going to be a great webinar. But right now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Marian and Emma.
Hi, Marian, I think you're muted.
Perfect. All right, hi guys. My name is Marian Grskovich. A little bit about me. I'm first year master's student at the Eastern Shore AREC. I'm primarily studying faba bean pathology and specifically chocolate spot, which is a fungal disease. And right now I'm just getting the works of that out here in the lab.
Okay, so I'm Emma Nieland. I'm a second year master's student that's studying watermelon, specifically anthracnose, which is also a fungal disease. I'm currently on campus, just kind of getting my lab stuff situated, but I think we can just hop right in.
Today we're going to go over just the basics of brassica crops, what you're going to see in the garden versus what you're going to see on a more industrial side, and then talk about 6 major diseases like black rot, alternaria, blackleg, clubroot, downy mildew, and then wire stem. And then we'll close it off with some just general management recommendations and how you can mitigate these issues on your own. And then we'll have time for questions at the end.
Okay, so first, you might be wondering kind of why brassicas are important besides just, your normal vegetable crops. So brassicas are actually used in quite a different variety of ways. They're used as cover crops, obviously food production. They're also used in very aesthetic reasons in some more like industrial gardens. They're also used as animal feed and have a lot of like production uses. So there's actually over 350 genera of brassicas, which is kind of why you see so many uses of the plant. They're planted not only worldwide, but also all over this country. For example, there are almost 110,000 acres of broccoli planted this year, or not this year, in 2023, with the total income being over a little over $1 billion, which is a lot of money. So, in terms of garden brassicas, which are probably more what you guys will be interacting with, the first genre is Brassica oleracea. This includes your cabbages, broccoli, cauliflower, kale. Next is Eureka vesicaria, subspecies sativa, and this is specifically arugula. Next is Brassica rapa, which is your turnip, snapper cabbage, bok choy, and some others. Another big one is Raphanus sativus, which is your radishes. And then the last main garden brassica is Junci, which is your mustard greens. So these are some more brassicas that you may interact with. However, these are more your agricultural or industrial based brassicas. First is Brassica napus. There are over 736 million tons of this crop produced worldwide. It's mostly used for vegetable oil production. Next is Nigra, which is actually used in a lot of different ways. It's obviously used as food, considering it's mustard, but there's also uses in medicine, oil, cover crops, and various repellents. The next one is Carnita. This is specifically used as a biofuel in jets and airplanes, but it's also used as a low carbon source or low carbon input animal feed. And then the last one is crab absinthica. The oil from this flower is used in a lot of skincare and hair care products as it's a very lightweight moisturizer, but it's also seen in lubricant or corrosion inhibitors, various synthetic rubbers, plastic films, and a lot of nylons. So the first disease we're going to talk about is black rot. This is a bacterial infection caused by Xanthomonas campestris, pathovirus campestris. It can infect virtually all brassica crops. There's not really any out there that aren't affected by this disease. Its symptoms can also appear at any growth stage. So from seedling to finished vegetable, you have the chance of getting black rot. In terms of symptoms, the main symptom of black rot is a V-shaped lesion that kind of starts at the leaf edge and moves towards the base of the leaf. The interior of that lesion is going to be a lot of necrotic tissue, just meaning dead tissue. And then the margins of that lesion are going to be more of a chlorotic tissue, which kind of signifies a dying tissue. These lesions can induce wilt and necrosis throughout the whole entire plant. Also within and sort of next to these lesions will be those black veins that you can see in that middle photo. This is kind of indicative of some sort of lack of water or transfer of nutrients throughout that area. Um, in terms of root crops, there might not be visible symptoms on the above ground tissues, but if you pull it up, you're going to see those blackened veins on those roots. So, in terms of lifestyle, this disease really prefers warm, wet weather or warm, wet weather, specifically between 80 and 86 degrees Fahrenheit. This water is really important. It can be in the form of rain, dew, irrigation, as it is required for the disease to establish and grow within the garden. Um, it also can survive in the soil independently, 40 to 60 days. And if it's found on debris, it can survive for up to 2 years. So if you find black rot around a year, it's likely it's going to come back the next year. Um, in terms of its life cycle, the bacteria sort of enters through any pores or wounds found on the plant. This goes on to infect the vascular tissue, which leads to the development of those V-shaped lesions. And then it will also turn systemic, which means it's found all throughout the plant. From the systemic infection, it can infect the seeds and has a higher likelihood of surviving on various debris, allowing the disease to recur year after year. It's also important to note that as little as 0.03% of infection can cause epidemics. So even if one of your plants is infected, likely your whole entire crop will become infected. For managing this disease, the few of the main ways are to first make sure you're planting resistant or tolerant cultivars. And this kind of goes hand in hand with purchasing only disease-free seeds. It's also important to avoid handling plants in wet conditions because if you do have black rot on one plant and then you touch that and go on and move down your garden, there's a high likelihood you're going to be transferring it to all the surrounding plants. And also making sure to kind of reduce injury to your plants because, as I mentioned, the disease enters through any sort of opening in the tissue.
All right, so the next one we'll talk about is Alternaria leaf blight and head rot. This is a fungal disease caused by Alternaria brassicicola. And again, it has a broad host range in the Brassicaceae family, but primarily you're going to see it on broccoli, kale, cabbage, cauliflower, and a few of the other main ones. Initially, you'll see super small pinhole black lesions on the leaves. Like you can see in that middle picture, they start really small and then progress into larger lesions. Um, they can tend to have that dry, tan, brown region around the initial lesion and then have a chlorotic halo on the exterior. Um, and initially, they'll start as singular spots, but then as the disease progresses, like in the middle picture, you can see they kind of just combine together and form like one large section of disease, basically. And then also during more mature stages, you can see concentric rings start to form, which are from like visible black spores beginning to be produced. And then, as you can see in this right photo here, there's a few brown spots with sort of yellow halos around them. That's what the head rot is from. It's the same fungal species, but just the infection takes place on the head versus on the leaves. And that you can usually see in later stages of infection, or if the infection begins when the plant's at its maturity. And then symptom timing wise, generally you'll see the pinhole lesions begin on the lower leaves first and sort of just work their way up the plant. So overall, Alternaria brassicicola is the primary pathogen that causes this disease. There are a few other species of Alternaria in the US that have been found to cause similar symptoms, but brassicicola is the main species for this issue. And so, like I said, it's a fungus, so it's primarily spread via spore dispersal through either water or wind. And so whenever those spores land, they'll germinate onto the plants. You'll see the lesions, they'll begin to sporulate again, and then the life cycle just continues, or they can overwinter in dormant structures or on alternate hosts, like Brassica species hosts. So if you're using some sort of cover crop or a winter brassica and you had this issue earlier in the season, that might not be the best idea to do. But some other management recommendations is, I think you'll probably hear this for almost every single disease, but finding those resistant cultivars. For example, in broccoli, the asteroid and imperial cultivars are, I guess, super popular for still tasting good and producing what you want to produce, but they're more resistant or at least less susceptible to Alternaria leaf blight. But ultimately, cultural practices are going to be your best bet. So again, the screen seeds, removing debris after each season, and also if you see infection occur, removing that diseased plant material, and then sanitizing your tools with either like 70% ethanol or at least like soap and water. And then, yeah, removing infected plants if you do see them pop up.
Okay, so the next one we're going to talk about is blackleg. This is a fungal disease caused by Phoma lingam. Sort of like a lot of these diseases, it can infect a lot of different brassica crops. So if you find it in one, it's likely going to be in your other vegetables. Similar to black rot, the symptoms can appear at pretty much any growth stage. They will look slightly different, but they are susceptible no matter where they are in their growing. So let's kind of start with stem lesions. You can see an example of that in that middle photo. So these lesions kind of start as small and very tan, but as they kind of grow, they elongate, turn a more darker brown, and then develop a black and purple border around the edges. They also may sink into the tissue and form lots of small little pycnidia, which you can kind of think of spore factories. They will also potentially extend below the surface of the soil and attack roots. In terms of leaf lesions, which you can kind of see in that left-hand photo, they start very small and irregular shaped, but they can grow and become more necrotic and grayish in color and will be confined by leaf veins, which form that sort of irregular shape seen there. There will also be potentially a darker margin of necrotic tissue. For root brassicas like radishes, they have slightly different symptoms. The roots will form cankers and dry rot may appear in storage due to this. For seed brassicas, the symptoms usually develop after flowering. It starts as oval-shaped lesions around leaf scars with either a gray center and black margin or sort of transverse black streaks throughout the plant. There is also a chance that the only symptom will be the xylem sort of being blackened, but this isn't quite as common. So sort of like a lot of these diseases as well, it prefers wet, rainy weather. Um, However, important to note is that it can persist in the soil for quite a long time. It can live for up to 4 years in seeds and 3 years in debris. So again, it can survive for a very long time. So for the primary infection of blackleg, infected seedlings will form pycnidia, which, like I mentioned, are kind of like spore producers. These will produce a lot of spores, and when conditions are ideal, these spores sort of exude from those pycnidia and spread through either splashing water or wind or through your like movement throughout the gardens and infect nearby plants. The secondary route of infection is through seeds or plant residue. So as the weather starts to warm up, another spore forming structure called pseudothecia sort of form on the residues and uh, start to produce these spores. And then as these spores spread, they are kind of dispersed to the surrounding plants and kind of create an epidemic within the garden. Infection through this route also results in lesions, and as those lesions form, they create those pycnidia and just sort of repeat the cycle over and over again.
All right, so our next one is clubroot. This is actually caused by a parasitic protist called Plasmodiaphora brassicaceae. So protists are not fungal, bacterial, or viral. They're their own eukaryotic organism, super small, often can have similar life cycles to fungi and bacteria depending on the species. But again, this is another one that has a super broad host range. So basically all Brassica species are susceptible to this. We see a lot of it in broccoli, kale, and cabbage. And then the primary symptoms, as the name says, club root, the roots are pretty swollen and deformed and often in a club-like shape. In your root vegetables, you'll see on the right picture, the tips of the roots often get super swollen. And then in more severe cases, the entire outer surface can be sort of warty with growths. And then in your non-root vegetables, like in the picture of the collard greens on the left, it'll form more of like a coral type structure. Some other symptoms that you might see is wilting leaves and stems, and then they're super susceptible to drought stress because the roots are your main water intake sources. So if they're all messed up and swollen, you're not going to have great water intake for those plants. And in this middle picture, you can see that if infection occurs on younger plants, they often either will cease to grow, die off, or will just be super stunted and just might not ever mature. On older plants, they generally just don't produce a head for harvesting, like they just won't reach maturity or can just die off from the wilting and lack of water intake. As far as symptom timing, you'll generally see this in the midsummer to late summer. And then oftentimes the infection occurs a lot sooner than when the above ground symptoms start to form. So usually it's too late by the time that you see this issue to fix it, but sometimes the plants can still mature and you can have a harvest. So as far as the disease cycle, this generally starts with infected transplants being planted. So like you go to Lowe's or another nursery or place that you're getting your plants from, if those are already infected and you plant those, then that'll introduce the protist into the soil biome. And then once those roots are infected, they begin to swell like in the photos. And then spores form within those, which are released back into the soil. And there have been recorded cases where it's up to like 20 years that this protist is in the soil. So That's not a great situation to be in. And then in general, these protists will then reinfect new plants when the soil is super wet and super acidic. So as far as management goes, um, generally just like keeping the soil pH above 7.2. That can either be with lime or some other ways to decrease the soil acidity. And then avoid growing brassicas where the infection has occurred, at least for a couple years. And there are a few less susceptible species out there that have shown that, like, after waiting about 3 to 5 years of planting more brassicas again, and then you plant those, you're generally going to have a better crop than if you had a susceptible cultivar. And then again, like everything else, sanitizing equipment, just general cultural practices. And because this protist does prefer a moist soil, increasing your soil drainage in your garden or field is going to help a lot.
Okay, so another really important disease is downy mildew. This can also infect a lot of brassicas as well as a lot of other crops and vegetables. So there is a chance you guys have heard this in reference to other crops. It is an oomycete, which means it is basically just a fungal-like organism. Um, Also, symptoms can appear at pretty much any growth stage for this vegetable or for this disease as well. So downy mildew is really damaging to seedlings. It can reduce yield at later growth, but if you catch it early, you might want to consider just replanting or starting over because there is a high likelihood that it will just kind of wipe out your crop. So, how you kind of determine that you got downy mildew is dependent on what growth stage. So if you see in seedlings, it kind of starts as these bright yellow irregular shaped spots on the leaves with a network of black spots or lines throughout those lesions. These yellow spots will slowly turn into necrotic spots that will spread throughout the whole seedling and cause it to die. Under cool, moist conditions, you might also see sort of a white cottony growth on the underside of the leaf, which you can kind of see in that second photo right there. Um, in older crops and older leaves, the lesions will also be yellow, but they will be more angular instead of irregular shaped and be on the upper surface of the leaf. These will also enlarge, but they won't necessarily be quite as necrotic. And that growth that you might see on the undersurface of the leaf will be more gray to purple instead of white. For broccoli and cauliflower and those sort of vegetables, you might see gray streaking on the branches beneath the florets as well. So the ideal conditions for downy mildew are slightly colder than some of these other diseases. It really likes around 50 to 59 degrees Fahrenheit with lots of moisture. It can also overwinter in both the soil and on crop debris, but there is a chance it could also grow or survive the winter on other weed hosts or crops, as it can infect a lot of different things. Um, Infections that usually occur early in the life cycle may kind of lay dormant and only start developing symptoms on the plant when the conditions are favorable again. It's also important to note that the whole life cycle, sporulation, germination, and reinfection can occur in as few as 4 to 5 days, which means that it's really important to take stock of your vegetables and just kind of make sure you're keeping an eye out for downy mildew because it can spread really fast. Um, and the spores themselves can spread through wind, water, and when the crops are in storage or when you got them, sitting on your kitchen counter, they can spread from one to the other. In terms of infection, systemic infections, which mean that the disease is found all throughout the plant, is usually thought to arise from spores that infect through the roots. Um, After that sort of initial infection, the pathogen then enters a growth stage where it spreads all throughout the plant's tissue, and then starts producing a lot more spores, which can then cause secondary infections through, rain or wind and spread to your surrounding crops. Marian, I think you're muted.
I knew I would do that at some point. Okay. Our next one is wire stem. This can also be called damping off, especially when it's in seedlings. This is caused by a fungal pathogen called Rhizoctonia solani. This has a pretty broad brassica host range. You'll mostly see it on broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, kale, Brussels sprouts, a lot of your main vegetable crops. The primary symptom is going to be dark lesions along the soil line, and then as these progress, these can girdle the stem, and that then reduces the water uptake to the above ground tissue. So you can see in the right and both the left pictures how it just kind of like shrinks all of a sudden, and it's just that like girdled like xylem tissue basically. And so in some other symptoms that you might see is if you pull the plant out and some of like the lateral roots, the entire soft tissue will just slough off, and what's left is just the tough xylem. You can also cause wilting in the leaves, and then there might be a bluish tint to younger leaves, as well as if this does occur in seedlings, it usually ends up killing off the young plants or seedlings. And then if this infection occurs at more later growth stages, it might just reduce or prohibit any head growth. And then a big issue of infection at like plant maturity is bottom rot. The same exact fungal species, but it's just a different disease name. But bottom rot is basically on like cabbage or kohlrabi, where they sit super low to the soil line, so that tissue just starts to rot on the bottom, hence the name bottom rot. And then as far as symptom timing, this is generally seen in younger hosts. So again, like your seedlings or your new transplants, where they're just not strong enough to fight off stuff. Or it might be because there's just like extra, like your soil is just super wet along that soil line. So for a disease cycle, it's generally a soil-borne pathogen, and oftentimes it feeds off of legume debris in the soil that was left over from, say you planted some sort of legume species the summer or the season before, and you just mix that into the soil. Rhizoctonia likes to feed off of leftover legume debris, so that can increase the pathogen population in the soil. And then they start their infection of like the root and crown area at the soil line. And particularly when you have super warm, moist, and heavy soil, like clay or just like other heavy types of soil. As far as management, increasing the drainage to the soil by either adding some looser soil types or bark even would be good for increasing the drainage. And then again, if you find susceptible cultivars, like Blue Max collard greens is less susceptible to rhizoctonia. And then if you're planting transplants, hold off on fertilizing until the plants have gotten a chance to really like take root and grow. And then again, with most things, avoid planting the transplants too deeply. So if you're planting the stem below the soil line, the stem isn't always able to fight off like that extra moisture, which can then be a way that fungal and bacterial pathogens can get into it. All right, so that's all for diseases. Those are our top 6 that you'll see most often in the Mid-Atlantic region and in the US. And so some general management recommendations. We have a list of like our top ones up here. I'd say honestly, in general, cultural practices and anything preventative is going to be your best bet. And like getting things set up right with your garden, planting the right cultivars are going to be more important than curative measures. I think probably between Emma and I, the biggest 2 are selecting resistant, tolerant, or less susceptible cultivars, and then purchasing disease-free seeds, as that'll set you up with some other management practices that'll set you up for great success. And then, so if there aren't really any less susceptible or resistant species available, focusing on other control methods like those below are gonna be super helpful. And so I put a picture of our disease triangle in here. This is something that I think almost every pathology student has learned in their like intro classes. This is like ingrained in us, but it's super helpful because so in order for a pathogen to be successful and cause disease, it needs to have three things in favor of the pathogen. And so that's going to be that the host is susceptible, the environment is favorable, and that the pathogen is present and able to infect. And if all three are met, the disease will form. But you can't always remove the pathogen from the environment, or you can't always like find a resistant host. So targeting the favorable environment, like increasing drainage in your garden or doing other things that make the environment less favorable for the pathogen, that's going to knock out one of those three and have a less chance of disease. I think that's all we have for today. Thank you guys so much for joining us. And do we have any questions?
Thank you, Marian and Emma. I'm going to read a couple questions from the chat. We
Okay.
did get a question about spray programs for fungal diseases, and I answered that with our home grounds pest management guide. There's a link to that in the chat, and all of our volunteers are familiar with that. There is a really good section in there on home vegetable management, but just know, depending on where you look for chemical control measures, that you might find a chemical that's either restricted or you need a license to apply in Virginia, which you guys as EMGs may not have. But there's a lot of home recommendations, and those are listed in the home grounds PMG. We're getting a lot of questions about disease-free seeds and sterilizing seeds and like where to get clean seed. Can you guys talk a little bit more about that process and clean seed and sterile seed and what that really means?
Sure, yeah. So in general, if you're buying from reputable companies, they're going to have some sort of screening that they go through. You can usually find out what they mean by that on their websites. But usually it just means that they either are using some sort of like spore trapping method or way to like first identify if there's any pathogen population within those seeds, and then also sometimes they add treatment to the seeds for like the top diseases that may occur for that plant. But also another really good thing is if you have a really good crop one season and they're healthy and they're strong and they're looking good, like letting a few of those plants go to seed and starting your seed collection from there is super beneficial because then you know where they're coming from, you know that they're disease free, like they're going to be good.
There was also some questions about insect vectors for diseases. Are any of these diseases spread by insect presence, and if not, how would you expect them to be spread from garden to garden?
I know for sure Alternaria it is oftentimes spread by insect vectors. A lot of times aphids or other super small like leaf beetles, when they're feeding on the plant, their feeding is not necessarily detrimental to the plant, but it can open a wound for other pathogens to then enter. So I'd say as far as that, if you do see feeding like signs, so like it's gonna be like little squiggly lines on leaves or like little chunks taken out of the edges or other like insect feeding signs. I would look into what insects are most prominent for that plant and see if there's some sort of pesticide that's available for home use in that regard.
Yeah.
I also, when we talk about plant pathology, there's vectors, or there's a technical, when you're talking to a plant pathologist, there's a technical definition of a vector. And for that, it has to be something where they actually ingest plant material, and then when their saliva interacts with a plant, then that's how they transmit. That's why most of the vectors that we see are usually insects with piercing, sucking mouth parts, or the diseases that are vectored are viral diseases and not usually fungal diseases. But it's important to note, like Marian said, that there's lots of different things that can move that stuff around. One of the things that we're really concerned with in a lot of these issues is soil and soil-borne diseases. So it's okay if you guys don't have a complete answer, but could you kind of hypothesize solutions for if you were to have one of those diseases in your raised bed garden, how you would go about kind of treating that if with like non-chemical management. I'm thinking that there's like in my raised bed garden, I've got maybe 4 inches of soil in my raised bed, higher than my garden, but I'm not sure that actually removing all of that topsoil and replacing it would be enough to counteract soil-borne diseases. Can you guys talk a little bit more about that? It's okay if it's a hypothesis.
Yeah, we're good. Emma, would you like to take a stab at this one?
Yeah, so since a lot of crops or vegetables and various plants that I'm assuming you guys are working with have root systems that are going to be quite larger than 4 inches, removing that topsoil isn't going to do much because that plant debris can survive further down into the dirt. So while it may help lessen the amount of disease found throughout your garden, it won't necessarily completely remove the source.
Yeah, I think also too, looking at what the pathogen likes. So if you know it's something that thrives in super damp soil, I would look at how often you're watering and how much your garden plants really need water versus you're just doing it on a schedule and your soil's getting like too soaked. Because if it's staying soaked for a long time, most often a lot of soil-borne pathogens love that. And so maybe limiting your watering and using different types of soil to increase the drainage, make it less friendly to the different pathogens that you're trying to mitigate.
Yeah, there's for the soil-borne diseases, there's a lot of soil components there. So obviously having clean seed or starting with clean transplants is really important, but in order to have a good integrated pest management system, there's lots of different components. Catherine asked to remove leaves from the garden. If you have Brassica diseases or plant diseases in general, you probably should take those out. If you have unhealthy plants that should not go in your compost pile, you should remove those from your garden and throw them away, because those overwintering structures can outlast the plant tissue breaking down, and that can be a way to transmit diseases. But like Marian and Emma said, soil type, drainage, all of that. Just remember your basics from your plant pathology class. Warm and wet are things that pathogens really like, and they also like to eat the food that you're growing for yourself. I think, and I might have missed this early in the presentation, did you guys talk about soil pH and club rot earlier?
Yeah. So that one that prefers a more acidic soil. And I know some, like especially I think more fruits generally than vegetables also prefer acidic soil. So if you are growing a plant that is going to be okay with a more basic soil, I would go for that rather than having super high or low pH.
Yeah,
Another
soil
thing,
testing is a good thing. You guys all know how to do a soil test to make sure when you're soil testing, you know your pH, because that does have an impact.
mhm. Yeah, a lot of the when I worked at Purdue's plant diagnostic clinic, we would almost always, if we got soil, do a soil test for it, because it gives you a ton of information.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you guys want to talk about crop rotation in the home garden and whether or not the pathogens move in the soil and how they could be moved from like we'll take an example of like my 4 raised beds in my garden that I normally rotate through at home. So normally it's 4 years before between brassica plantings in my home garden. Can you talk about risks there for moving the pathogen around?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, Emma, go ahead.
Okay. I'm just gonna touch on rotation real quick. So, in terms of rotation, it's obviously really good to consistently rotate your crops because, as we mentioned, pathogens can survive in debris or in the soil or a lot of different ways they can overwinter. However, the length of that rotation is kind of dependent on what disease you're working with and more on the practical side, how much room you have. Because not all of you guys are gonna, like Grace said, have 4 different gardens to work with. Um, so it's kind of like a balance that you have to decide for yourself, um, how much you're willing to risk planting brassica after brassica, and also how much room that you're working with.
I think something else to add with that too is like if you're using compost between different beds, also make sure you're not putting any sort of disease material and like then composting that and transferring it to different beds because that can also increase the pathogen population.
Yep. We have a question about what time of year to grow brassicas. If we're trying to avoid warm and wet weather, should we avoid growing brassicas in the summer? It's kind of hard to in Virginia, depending on where you
Yeah.
are.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely some areas where you can successfully grow certain brassicas like over winter if it's like a milder winter, but I don't I think you might just have to just deal with it.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that's just how it is sometimes.
Yeah. We also have a question about I guess it's not technically compost, but I feed a lot of scraps to my chickens, and one of our attendees feeds a lot of scraps to their rabbits, and then uses those that fertilizer to fertilize the garden. I don't know if alternaria would survive the digestive tract. Um, I don't know if there's been any research done on that.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. That would be
I,
something really interesting to look
Yeah.
up though.
that's a Doug question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, there's a question about solarization. So, do you guys, I've done some solarization work, but I'm not sure if you guys have done more with brassicas. You might want to talk about that.
I personally have never done work with solarization, but I know there are obviously some benefits to it, specifically because you'll be killing off the pathogen. However, there is some drawbacks because solarization does not differentiate between good bacteria and bad bacteria or good organisms and bad organisms. So you will be killing off everything. So you have to make sure to go back and sort of reestablish a healthy population. To ensure that you'll be having that interaction between your plant and then the soil environment.
Yeah. I've done some solarization both at home and when I was a local agent with our extension master gardeners. The challenge in Virginia is that it is not sunny enough for long enough to normally get that soil to a temperature that would kill what we're trying to kill. Some parts of the Virginia, if you're coastal Virginia, if you're one of those zones like 8A, 8B, you might have more luck, but where we were in central Virginia, we did not have as much luck. And typically it's only recommended in like much more southern sunny climates. The way that it works is you can create a sealed environment by sealing plastic over the soil that you want to treat. And the sun heats the inside of that kind of like a little oven, and it heats the soil and it gets so hot that it kills what's in there. And it's not just going to kill, you know, problem bacteria, it's also going to kill the good stuff, and it's also going to kill your, it can kill weed seeds, it can kill weed roots, but what we experienced in Central Virginia is that you need a period of like 4 months for our temperatures in Virginia to effectively get some like good results. And it's kind of hard to find 4 sunny months, like 4 sunny months to get that done, depending on where you are in Virginia. Additionally, one of the practical challenges that we had was keeping that sealed environment sealed, because as you can imagine, just like when you open an oven door and all that heat comes out, if the wind rips through and punches holes in your plastic, all that heat goes away. And with solarization, you're going for temperature and time. And so you basically start all over every time you have to reset your tarp, or you get a hole in your tarp, or anything like that. And so there's a challenge there. When we talk about integrated pest management specifically for yourselves and for the clients that you guys advise, there's these kinds of things like fungal treatments and solarization and crop rotation and soil pH are all just a part of a good plan. The reason that we study diseases like this and in systems like this is because they're not easy to treat without having a big plan. And we don't want to just throw pesticides at things that we don't have to. So, our last question in the chat is, would drought kill off some of those fungi? My guess is it probably depends on which one. So downy and powdery mildew downy is probably going to be more impacted by dry, but both of those diseases, they like humidity. So you can have high relative humidity and not have rain. Or you can have high enough relative humidity to sustain pathogen life and still not have rain. I guess it depends on the severity of the drought, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think also too, it's then comes down to if the drought is at the same, like you want the drought to be before you plant, or else if there's a drought while your broccoli are growing, you're going to keep watering those broccoli and not fully get rid of them. So you'd have to have like the perfect scenario to have a really good drought before and then load up the soil with water so that your plants are successful then.
Yeah,
Like
our irrigation does
thing.
impact that. Yeah. Okay, if there aren't any more questions, I think that we've had a really good, nice, focused, productive webinar. And thank you guys. I really love having graduate students present for us. I think you guys are very engaging, very friendly, and it's also really nice just to have some peers on the webinar. So thank you guys. Everybody say thank you to Marian and Emma, and thank you to their advisor, Dr. Doug Higgins, for helping us find these lovely ladies to talk to us today.
Yeah, thank you guys. This is fun.
Yes. Thank you for having us.
All right, thank you guys. Bye.